So a few days ago, I made a video talking about why Dana White needs to be fired from the UFC at this point. And one of the main points I brought up is that the UFC does not promote their fighters. But I've seen a couple comments in this video that there's a UFC marketing team and how it's not Dana White's fault that there's a lack of promotion going on. And that got me thinking, what does the UFC marketing team actually do? You know, are they actually good at promoting? Or is it trash like I initially thought? I'm gonna go over as many promotional pieces the UFC put out for their fighters, and overall give my assessment as to whether or not uh, things need to change, or if it's better than what I give it credit for. So yeah, without wasting any more time, let's jump right into the video. Starting off with the Dana White announcements. This is arguably why the majority of the fan base is sick of the UFC marketing team, because this is how most fans know whether or not a fight is taking place or not. Dana White is repetitive and dull. Like, how many times do we have to hear that the fact that this is a badass fight? But I kind of get why it is repetitive and dull. Like, it's more of an announcement, so he's not supposed to be all that flashy, but I understand why people are frustrated because this is how most people know whether or not a fight is taking place. Now, on to the highlights the UFC posts. This is arguably the most common way the UFC promotes their fights by posting highlights of certain fighters on the main card on either Instagram, TikTok, or whatever for platform. It's cool and all. It does its job. I'm not gonna be too critical about this because I'm not expecting like a huge like flux in like excitement for a fight based on a couple of highlight clips that I've already seen in past fights. But I guess if it's for someone who's tuning in, I guess it does the job. You know, like you can just quickly scroll through like a quick highlight reel KO and be like, oh shit, I need to go watch this fight now. So yeah, overall does this job. I'm not gonna be too critical about the couple of highlights. All right, now on to the posters. I like the posters recently. Like, I used to hate the posters, but seeing the recent ones that coming out, like for UFC 316, UFC 317, and UFC 318, I'd say they're very nice. These posters don't look like someone just whipped it up on Photoshop in like 3 or 4 hours. Like, this looks like professional work, and I can't replicate this. So I do enjoy the posters, and I have to give it a lot more credit than what I initially did because my initial impressions of posters were like stuff from UFC Montreal back in 2024 because I can guarantee I can whip this up in 3 or 4 hours on Photoshop. Like, this poster looks god awful, but recently they've been looking very nice. Now moving on to the UFC countdown, I really enjoy these. These are like 45 to 47-minute long form documentaries talking about the journeys that uh, the fighters on the main and co-main event have gone through, what they've been doing outside of the cage, their journey to the UFC title, and just their backstory and how they got into training and stuff like that. I consider the countdown episodes the best promotional material out there. If you haven't watched the latest one for UFC 316, I highly recommend you to watch it because it's very nice. I couldn't ask for anything better. I don't need anything changed about the UFC countdowns. If anything, they're great. So I gotta give props to the UFC marketing team for that. Now on to the UFC Embedded. Now this is where I'm gonna start to be critical of the UFC and their marketing team. So if you don't know, the UFC Embedded is basically a series of blogs that the UFC puts out where like fighters on the main card are talking about what they're doing leading up to the fight, what they have been doing over the past several months. It's good in concept, but the UFC just drags it out for way too long. Like, I know their goal is to try and humanize the fighters that are on the main card, or sometimes those on the prelims that the UFC is really high on. But there's only so many times where I can just listen to how X fighter had the best training camp of their life, or how this fighter, like, their weight cut is really good, or how they're training the specifics. They've all done the hard work during training camp, and now it's just repetition. Like, it gets repetitive. I'm not blaming the fighters for this because the concept itself is kind of repetitive after you get to like the third or fourth episode because there's only so much to talk about when there's only like what 3 days left before the fight starts. Now, moving on to the press conferences. I gotta say this though, most of these press conferences are hot garbage. I know that most of these fighters aren't exactly Conor McGregor on the fight, let alone half of them barely speak English. But can we not do this while their weight drained to 20 pounds, Dana White? Like, if you wanted to put out a press conferences, like, do it a week before when, like, the fighter is kind of healthy and, like, they're still maybe they're starting to weight cut, but they're not drained, like, to the point where, like, they can barely walk. This is arguably the most important piece of promotional material, and unfortunately, Dana White doesn't see it that way because even when the press conference gets good, Dana White, he just comes in and he's like, "All right, that's a wrap up." Like 15 minutes in, just when the press conference is getting hot. So by far, this is the worst piece of promotional material the UFC puts out, and that's kind of sad because it's arguably the most important because that's how we as fans get hyped for certain matchups. Now, moving on to Nina Drama. All right. Other than the fact that she is just a whore and is one step away from just making an OnlyFans account, I just don't like Nina Drama. Like, she just shakes her tits and ass in order to get views. She'll occasionally ask a good question, but most of the questions she asks are quite retarded.
Three fighters that you would want to be on your team to fight off aliens.
And every time she asks a good question, it is offset by the fact that she just needs to show off her tits for no apparent reason. If I wanted to goon, I would be doing it on the hub on my own time. I don't need to do it while I'm trying to watch UFC promotional material. I'm trying to keep those things separate. So, Nina Drama, I quite frankly don't understand why or how she's getting so many views. She doesn't ask any revolutionary questions, like for the majority of the time. It's not like she humanizes these fighters all that well. It's more about her just showing off her assets. And quite frankly, there's only so many times I can watch that before I'm like, all right, I'm watching something else because this is just one step away from porn. I've been very critical of Nina Drama, but the only thing worse than Nina Drama interviews are the quirky skits. This is by far the worst form of promotion the UFC has been putting out there over the past several months. The UFC has these fighters guessing for a bag of milk or like testing their grip strength. Like, it just shows how tune deaf the company is because we don't care. Like, tell us more about why we need to get excited for a certain fight. I don't need to see these fighters like do these dumbass skits for no apparent reason. Half the time, like I don't even know why they're doing it. Like especially when they're going to foreign countries, like when they were having fighters guess for a bag of milk because it's like some sort of traditional thing in Canada. Like I feel like if you're gonna do that, you gotta at least explain it first. But for some reason, the UFC doesn't, and it just makes it look more dumb than it should be. Last but not least, we gotta get to the Zoom calls. This is a step in the right direction for the UFC. I'll take this over the fact that the UFC has no one-on-one sit downs over the past 4 or 5 years. Uh, this could be done live though. I'm just saying, like, I'm not gonna be too critical because we could have the alternative reality where like we get no one-on-one sit downs where fighters get to just freely talk trash to each other face to face, but it could be done live, and I think that would be much better. Unfortunately, this is also very rare, And the only time it's been done was for Ilya Taporia versus Max Holloway and Juliana Pena versus Kayla Harrison. I think bare minimum we should be getting this one or two of these every single pay-per-view, and it doesn't necessarily have to be for a title fight. Like it could be a fight on the main card where like there's a lot of beef going into it. Like for example, you could have done this for Bryce Mitchell versus Gene Silva. I would have sat there and watched the entire thing, getting hyped up for that fight because that would have been crazy. But unfortunately, the UFC barely puts any of these out. But considering we didn't have any of these for like 4 or 5 years, I'll take it. The UFC marketing team, it does more than what I initially gave it credit for. Their posters are very nice compared to what I remember it for. Their countdown episodes are very informative about what's at stake for the main and co-main event. And they're now starting to bring back one-on-one sit-downs where fighters can just talk trash to each other. But the quirky skits, Nina drama, and press conferences, they're all hot garbage. The embedded episodes, once it gets to the fourth episode, they're just dragging it out way too long. And the UFC still hasn't figured out that the in-person sit-downs are way better than the Zoom calls when it comes to one-on-one trash talk. So overall, I want to say I do give the UFC marketing team a lot more props than what I initially did, but make no mistake, they're still trash, and Dana White is still a trash promoter. All right, that's gonna be it for today's video. Leave a comment down below whether or not you agree that the UFC marketing team is still hot garbage. We don't have to watch these fighters do these dumbass skits testing out their grip strength. We don't need Dina Drama to flash her tits and ass every minute or so. And we don't need the press conferences to go on for 15 minutes with fighters who can barely walk because they're weight drained of 25 pounds. But yeah, if you agree with that, make sure to leave a comment and also leave a comment down below what video idea you want to see next. But other than that, make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.